The champagne flute trembled in my hand as my father's voice cut through the wedding reception like a blade through silk. Sarah will never amount to anything, he announced to Judge Morrison and three other distinguished guests at Table 7, his words carrying over the gentle string quartet and the soft murmur of 200 wedding guests. 25 years old and still chasing fairy tales. Law school dropout, failed artist, can't even hold down a retail job. I stood frozen behind a marble pillar draped in white roses and baby's breath, my bridesmaid's dress, a soft lavender that had taken 3 months of saving to afford, suddenly feeling like a costume I had no right to wear. The Fairmont Grand Hotel's crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across my face as tears threatened to spill, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape the gravitational pull of my father's casual destruction of everything I'd tried to build. Judge Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his weathered hands adjusting his tie. I'd known him since I was 7 years old when he'd first started attending my stepmother's dinner parties. He'd always been kind to me, asking about school, remembering my birthday, treating me with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to my father's perpetual disappointment. "Richard," Judge Morrison said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss something else." But my father was just getting started. The Scotch had loosened his tongue and sharpened his cruelty. No, Harold, you need to understand what I've been dealing with. Sarah thinks she's going to be some kind of social worker now. Social work after I spent $40,000 on her first year of law school before she quit. After I paid for art classes, music lessons, tutoring, throwing good money after bad. He gestured with his whiskey glass, the amber liquid catching the light. My business associates ask about my children, and I have to tell them about David's promotion to senior partner at Goldman Sachs, and then... He paused for effect, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried further than his earlier proclamation. Then I have to explain Sarah. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen, precisely aimed at the places where I was already bleeding. I pressed my back against the cool marble, feeling the rough texture through the thin fabric of my dress. My bouquet, white roses and eucalyptus that I'd helped arrange that morning with trembling fingers and desperate hope that today would be different, felt heavy in my sweating palm. Mrs. Chen, my stepmother's elderly aunt, reached across the table and placed her small, spotted hand on my father's arm. "Richard," she said in her soft accent, "family is precious thing. Words once spoken cannot be taken back." Her eyes found mine across the crowded reception hall, and I saw something there. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred pain. "Sarah's a good girl," added Marcus Webb, Judge Morrison's nephew, who worked as a court reporter and had always been unfailingly polite during our few interactions at family gatherings. "She helped my grandmother with her groceries every week last winter after her hip surgery. Never asked for anything in return." My father's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Helping an old woman with groceries doesn't pay rent, Marcus. It doesn't build a career. It doesn't make up for 25 years of wasted potential." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of casual authority in his $1,500 suit. "My business associates ask about my children, and I have to tell them about David's promotion to senior partner at Goldman Sachs, and then..." He paused for effect, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried further than his earlier proclamation. "Then, I have to explain Sarah. The community center," he said it like a disease. Like the work I did there, the only work that had ever made me feel like I mattered, was something shameful. I thought about the children who waited for me every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, their faces lighting up when they saw the art supplies I brought. 8-year-old Miguel, who'd never held a paintbrush before I showed him how to blend colors. 12-year-old Aisha, whose drawings of her grandmother made me cry the first time I saw them. 10-year-old Chen, who spoke no English when he started, but communicated entire stories through his sketches. "The community center serves 300 families," I whispered, though no one could hear me over the music and conversation. 300 families that matter.
Judge Morrison was speaking again, his voice measured and careful. "Community service is admirable work, Richard. Some of the most fulfilled people I know have chosen service over profit." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "Your daughter seems to have found her calling." "Her calling?" My father's voice rose slightly, and I saw several nearby tables turn to look. Harold, you're a judge. You understand the importance of achievement, of making something of yourself. What kind of calling involves earning $22,000 a year and living paycheck to paycheck? What kind of future is that? I wanted to scream that it was my future, that it was enough, that the children I worked with saw me as someone who mattered even if he never would. But the words stuck in my throat like broken glass, sharp and cutting and impossible to swallow or spit out. My cousin Emma appeared at my side suddenly, her own bridesmaid's dress rustling softly. "Sarah, honey, are you okay? You look pale." She followed my gaze to the table where my father held court, and her expression darkened. Oh no, what's he saying now? Emma had always been my ally in the complex battlefield of family gatherings. 2 years older than me, she'd graduated from medical school the year before and was starting her residency at Children's Hospital in the fall. If anyone understood the weight of family expectations, it was Emma. But Emma had met those expectations, had exceeded them, had become the kind of success story that made parents beam with pride at dinner parties. "He's explaining me," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. "To Judge Morrison and the others. He's explaining why I'm such a disappointment." Emma's jaw tightened. "Sarah, you know that's not true. What you do matters. Those kids at the center love me. I know they do. But loving me doesn't make me successful in his eyes. It doesn't make me worthy of pride or respect or even basic human decency." I turned away from the table, unable to watch anymore. "I should go." "No," Emma's voice was firm. "This is Laura's wedding. You're her maid of honor. You're not leaving because Dad is being an ass." Laura, my stepsister, 3 years younger than me, getting married to a pediatric surgeon she'd met during her own medical residency. Laura, who'd held my hand during the rehearsal dinner and told me how grateful she was that I'd helped her choose the flowers, plan the centerpieces, coordinate with the caterers. Laura, who'd never once made me feel like I was less than enough. "She's beautiful," I said, looking across the reception hall to where Laura danced with her new husband, her face radiant with joy. "Look how happy she is." "She is happy. And part of that happiness comes from having you in her life. She told me yesterday that you're the most genuine person she knows, that you see beauty in everything and make everyone around you feel special." Emma squeezed my arm gently. "That's not nothing, Sarah. That's everything." But even as Emma spoke, I could hear my father's voice carrying across the reception hall, building to his grand finale. "The truth is, Harold, I've accepted that Sarah will never be more than she is right now. Some people are meant to be extraordinary, and some people are meant to be, well, ordinary. It's not her fault, really. Not everyone can rise above their limitations." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Limitations. As if my capacity for love, for nurturing, for seeing the beauty in small moments was somehow a defect rather than a gift. As if the children who ran to me every Tuesday and Thursday were worth less than stock portfolios and corporate bonuses. Judge Morrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Excuse me," he said to the table, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I need some air." I watched him walk toward the hotel's terrace doors, his shoulders rigid with tension. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded reception hall, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Disappointment, maybe? Or determination? Mrs. Chen was shaking her head, her small hands folded in her lap. "Such words," she murmured in Mandarin, though I caught the phrase because Laura had been teaching me basic conversational Chinese as a wedding gift to her new mother-in-law. "Such cruel words to speak about your own child." Marcus Webb excused himself from the table as well, following Judge Morrison toward the terrace. As he passed my pillar, he paused and looked directly at me. "Your father is wrong," he said quietly. His words meant only for me. Dead wrong. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his kindness meant, but my throat felt closed, swollen with unshed tears and unspoken protests. Instead, I nodded and tried to smile, though I could feel how brittle and broken it must have looked. The string quartet began playing Moon River, and couples moved onto the dance floor. I watched my father stand and offer his hand to my stepmother, watched them glide across the polished wood with practiced elegance. They looked perfect together, successful, sophisticated, the picture of achievement and social grace. Everything I would never be in his eyes. Emma was called away by her boyfriend who wanted to introduce her to some colleagues from the hospital. I stood alone behind my pillar, holding my wilting bouquet and wondering how it was possible to feel so invisible in a room full of people who had known me my entire life. Sarah! Laura appeared beside me, like an angel in white silk, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. Her face was flushed with joy and champagne, her eyes bright with happiness. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Are you hiding?" I forced a smile. "Just taking a breather. You look absolutely radiant, Laura. I'm so happy for you." She studied my face with the perceptive gaze that had always made her a good stepsister and would make her an excellent doctor. "You've been crying. What happened?" "Nothing. Just emotional. Weddings always make me cry." Laura took my hand, her fingers warm and steady. "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison." She used the middle name I'd chosen for myself when I was 12 and obsessed with Jane Austen novels. "You are the worst liar in the history of bad liars. Tell me what's wrong." I looked into her kind eyes and felt the last of my composure crumble. "Your dad thinks I'm a failure. He was telling Judge Morrison and the others about how disappointed he is in me, how I'll never amount to anything. And the worst part is, maybe he's right." Laura's expression shifted from concern to fury so quickly it took my breath away. "He said that? Today? At my wedding?" "Laura, it's okay." "No, it's not okay." Her voice was quiet but fierce. "It's not okay for him to hurt you, especially not today." "Sarah, you are one of the most extraordinary people I know. You have a gift for making people feel seen and valued and loved. That's not a small thing. That's everything." She pulled me into a hug, and I breathed in the scent of her perfume mixed with the roses in her bouquet. For a moment, I felt safe, protected by her fierce loyalty and unconditional love. "I want to tell you something," she said, pulling back to look at me. "Something I've never told anyone else. When my mother married your father, I was terrified. I was 8 years old, and suddenly I had this new family, new expectations, new ways of being in the world. But you," she smiled, and I saw tears in her eyes. "You made me friendship bracelets and taught me how to braid my hair and never once made me feel like I was intruding in your life. You were 12 years old, dealing with your own adjustment to having a stepfamily, but you chose kindness. You chose love."
"When your mother and I were 22, Judge Morrison continued, his voice steady despite the earthquake he'd just triggered, "we were engaged to be married. But I was accepted to law school at Harvard, and she was offered a teaching position in Chicago. We were young and foolish, and instead of finding a way to make it work, we chose ambition over love. She married Richard 2 years later, when you were barely walking. He adopted you legally, gave you his name, raised you as his own. I felt like I was drowning in air, my lungs working overtime but finding no oxygen. The judge, my father, my biological father, kept talking, but his words came to me as if through water, distorted and strange. I stayed in touch with your mother for the first few years, received pictures, updates on your progress, but Richard made it clear that my presence in your life would be complicated, unwelcome. So I stepped back, convinced myself it was better for everyone if I remained at a distance, a family friend, an honorary uncle. His voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through his judicial composure. It was the greatest mistake of my life. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. My mother never told me. She wanted to. We argued about it many times over the years, but she felt it would only confuse you, hurt you, create conflict in your family. She made me promise to let you have a normal childhood, a stable home. He turned to face me fully, and I saw tears in his eyes. After she died, when you were 15, I wanted to tell you then. But you were grieving, struggling, and Richard had made it clear that any interference from me would result in cutting off all contact. I couldn't risk losing you entirely. The memory of my mother's funeral hit me like a physical blow. I had been 15, raw with grief and anger, lashing out at everyone who tried to comfort me. Richard had been distant that day, uncomfortable with emotional displays, leaving me to navigate my sorrow largely alone. But Judge Morrison had been there. He'd sat in the back pew during the service, had found me afterward in the church garden where I'd gone to escape the crowd of mourners. She was proud of you, he'd told me that day, his voice gentle and sure. She talked about you constantly, your art, your kindness, your ability to see beauty in everything. She said you had an old soul. I thought it was just something adults said to grieving children. Now I understood it was a father trying to share his love for a daughter he couldn't claim. All these years, I said, my voice growing stronger, you've been watching me? The dinner parties, the family gatherings, the questions about school and work? Every moment I could steal. Every opportunity to be part of your life, even if only at the margins. When you started working at the community center, I made donations anonymously. When you needed money for art supplies for the children, funds somehow appeared in the center's budget. When you applied for that grant to expand the after-school program, I may have had conversations with the board members about the value of arts education. The world tilted again. The grant that got approved last month? The one that seemed too good to be true? $50,000 over 2 years, he said with a small smile. You wrote a beautiful proposal, Sarah. The board was impressed by your passion, your detailed budget, your understanding of the community's needs. I simply made sure they understood how exceptional you are. I looked out at the sea of faces, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Laura was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. Emma had moved to stand beside Marcus Webb, both of them watching with expressions of wonder and concern. And at table 7, Richard sat frozen, his whiskey glass forgotten in his white-knuckled grip. But why now? Why tell me here, in front of everyone? Judge Morrison's expression hardened slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of the bench. Because I have spent 25 years watching a man fail to appreciate the extraordinary daughter he was given. Because I have listened to him diminish your accomplishments, belittle your choices, and treat your compassion as if it were a character flaw rather than your greatest strength. He looked directly at Richard, his gaze steady,
Implacable. Because tonight, at his stepdaughter's wedding, he told a table of respected community members that you would never amount to anything, that you were ordinary, that you had limitations that prevented you from achieving greatness. The microphone picked up the collective intake of breath from the wedding guests. I could see the shock rippling through the crowd as they processed not just the revelation of paternity, but the context in which it was being revealed. Let me be clear about something, Judge Morrison continued, his voice rising slightly.
Sarah Morrison has spent her adult life serving her community with a dedication and joy that puts most of us to shame. She works with children that society has forgotten in a facility that operates on shoestring budgets and the goodwill of volunteers. She has taken kids who believed they had no future and shown them that they matter, that their voices deserve to be heard, that their creativity has value. He turned back to me, his expression softening. Last month, I received a letter from the mayor's office. They wanted to nominate someone for the Community Service Excellence Award, a recognition given to one person each year who has made an outstanding contribution to the welfare of our city's residents. Sarah, you were selected unanimously by a committee of 12 community leaders, none of whom knew of my connection to you. The words hit me like a warm wave, washing away years of accumulated doubt and shame. What? The award comes with a $10,000 prize and an offer to establish a permanent arts program in the city's community centers. The ceremony is next month. He smiled, and I saw in his expression the paternal pride that I'd spent my entire life craving from Richard. You've already amounted to everything that matters, sweetheart. You just needed someone to notice. I felt my knees wobble, and Judge Morrison's steady hand on my elbow kept me upright. The ballroom was spinning again, but this time with joy instead of shock. The faces in the crowd were smiling now, some people beginning to applaud, others wiping away tears. "There's something else," Judge Morrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a manila envelope. "Something I should have done 25 years ago." He opened the envelope and pulled out an official document, the heavy paper, crisp and formal. "Adoption papers, Sarah. Legal documents that will make what has been true in my heart since the day you were born, true in the eyes of the law as well." I stared at the papers, my vision blurring with tears. "You want to adopt me? I'm 25 years old." "Adult adoption is perfectly legal in this state," he said with a slight smile. "It doesn't change the fact that Richard raised you and provided for you all these years. But it does mean that you would legally be my daughter, entitled to everything that comes with that recognition, including," he added, his voice becoming more serious, "the trust fund your maternal grandmother established for you before she died, which I have been managing for the past 15 years. Trust fund? The words felt foreign on my tongue. Eleanora Morrison was a remarkable woman, your mother's mother, my ex-wife's mother, though she never stopped considering me family even after the divorce. When she died 5 years ago, she left specific instructions that you were to inherit her estate on your 25th birthday, provided you had found meaningful work that served others rather than simply enriching yourself." He gestured toward the crowd of wedding guests. "I think teaching art to underprivileged children qualifies." The ballroom was completely silent now, 200 people hanging on every word. I could see Laura leaning forward in her chair, her face radiant with joy and disbelief. Emma had her phone out, presumably texting her parents who lived across the country. And Richard was standing now, his face flushed with something between rage and humiliation. "This is ridiculous," he said loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Harold, you can't just waltz back into Sarah's life after 25 years and expect..." "Expect what, Richard?" Judge Morrison's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. "Expect to love my daughter? Expect to support her choices? Expect to treat her with the respect and dignity she deserves?" He stepped toward the microphone, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Sarah Morrison has spent her adult life making her feel small, inadequate, unworthy of love or recognition. You have systematically undermined her confidence, dismissed her achievements,
and treated her compassion as if it were a weakness to be ashamed of.
The silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Richard's face had gone from flushed to pale, his usual commanding presence reduced to something fragile and exposed. Sarah has never asked for wealth or status or recognition, Judge Morrison continued. She has simply asked to be loved and accepted for who she is. And who she is, Richard, is extraordinary. She is kind when kindness costs her. She is generous when she has little to give. She sees potential in forgotten children and nurtures it with a patience and creativity that most of us couldn't sustain for a week, let alone years. He turned back to me, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle, meant only for me despite the crowd of witnesses. Sarah, I know this is overwhelming. I know I should have told you privately, should have given you time to process all of this, but I couldn't stand by and watch him hurt you anymore. I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing the truth about your parentage, about your worth, about the way the rest of the world sees you when you're not looking through the lens of his disappointment. I looked out at the crowd, seeing faces I'd known my entire life looking back at me with expressions of joy, surprise, and something that looked like relief. Mrs. Chen was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Marcus Webb was beaming at me as if I'd just won the lottery. Even the waitstaff had stopped pretending to work and were listening with rapt attention. The trust fund, I managed to say, my voice shaky but audible through the microphone. How much? $250,000, plus the accumulated interest over the past 5 years. Enough to buy a house, to establish financial security, to expand your work at the community center if that's what you choose to do with it. $250,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having, more security than I'd ever dreamed of. But more than that, proof that someone, somewhere, had believed in me enough to plan for my future, had seen value in the work I loved, the choices I'd made, the person I'd become. I don't understand, I whispered. Why didn't you tell me before? Why wait until now? Judge Morrison's expression became pained, regretful. Because I was a coward, sweetheart. Because it was easier to love you from a distance than to risk the confrontation with Richard that would have inevitably followed. Because I told myself that you were better off with stability and legitimacy than with the complications my presence would bring. He reached out and took both my hands in his. But tonight, listening to him dismiss you so casually, so cruelly, I realized that my silence had become complicity, that by not claiming you, I had allowed him to make you feel unclaimed. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, years of accumulated pain and confusion pouring out of me in great shuddering sobs. Judge Morrison, my father, my biological father, pulled me into his arms, and I felt something settle into place that I hadn't even realized was broken. "It's okay," he murmured into my hair, his voice thick with his own tears. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're home now. You're exactly where you belong." The ballroom erupted into chaos as my tears finally stopped. Conversations broke out at every table, voices raised in excitement, concern, and speculation. I remained on the stage, still wrapped in Judge Morrison, my father's embrace, watching the ripple effects of our revelation spread through the wedding reception like concentric circles in a disturbed pond. Laura appeared at the foot of the stage, having navigated through the crowd with her wedding dress gathered in her hands. Her face was streaked with mascara, but she was laughing through her tears. "Sarah, oh my God, Sarah," she called up to us. "This is incredible! This is the most incredible thing that's ever happened!" Behind her, Emma was arguing animately with someone on her phone, presumably her parents in Seattle. "No, Mom, you heard me right. Harold Morrison is Sarah's biological father. Yes, the judge. Yes, he just announced it at Laura's wedding. No, I don't think anyone knew except him and Sarah's mother." But it was the reaction at table 7 that held my attention.
Richard sat alone now, my stepmother having moved to comfort a visibly shaken Mrs. Chen. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury, his hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He was staring at us with an expression I'd never seen before, not just anger or disappointment, but something darker. Hatred, maybe. Or the particular kind of rage that comes from being publicly humiliated by someone you've spent years privately tormenting.
Judge Morrison followed my gaze, and his jaw tightened. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something else. Something about why I chose to do this publicly, in front of witnesses." I pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Last week, I received a call from the director of the community center. She was concerned because someone had been asking questions about you, about your performance, your reliability, your relationships with the children and their parents. The caller claimed to be conducting a background check for a potential employer, but something about it felt off to Janet. She asked me if I knew anything about it." My blood went cold. "Richard?" I made some inquiries. The call came from Richard's office. "He's been trying to have you fired, Sarah. He contacted the community center, the United Way chapter that provides some of your funding, even the school district that partners with your after-school program. He told them you were unstable, unreliable, possibly using drugs." The words hit me like physical blows. Using drugs? I don't even drink more than a glass of wine at dinner. I know that. Janet knows that. Anyone who's worked with you for more than 5 minutes knows that. But Richard was hoping that enough whispers and insinuations would create doubt. He wanted to destroy your career before it could really begin. I looked across the ballroom at the man who'd raised me, who'd fed me and housed me and sent me to good schools, and tried to reconcile those memories with this new understanding of his cruelty. But why? What did I ever do to him? Judge Morrison's expression was grim. "I think Richard has always known, on some level, that you weren't his biological child. Your mother and I look too much alike for it to be coincidence. The same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way we tilt our heads when we're thinking. He spent 25 years resenting what he saw as her lie, her betrayal, and taking that resentment out on you." The pieces clicked into place with nauseating clarity. Richard's constant criticism, his refusal to acknowledge my achievements, his ability to find fault with everything I attempted. It wasn't disappointment in an underachieving daughter. It was punishment for existing as a reminder of his wife's past love. "He never wanted me," I whispered. "All those years, all those attempts to make him proud, he never wanted me at all." "No, sweetheart. He wanted to control your mother, and you were part of that package. But love you? Genuinely appreciate you for who you are? I don't think Richard is capable of that kind of unconditional affection." A commotion at table 7 drew our attention. Richard had stood up and was walking purposefully toward the stage, his face set in lines of cold determination. The conversations around him died away as people noticed his approach, and soon, the entire ballroom was watching in tense silence. "Sarah," he said when he reached the foot of the stage, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone's range, "I think we need to have a private conversation." "No." The word came out of my mouth before I even realized I was going to say it. "No, Richard. I'm done with private conversations where you get to control the narrative and make me feel small. If you have something to say to me, you can say it here, in front of everyone." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Fine, if that's how you want to play this." He turned to address the crowd, his voice taking on the smooth, authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption of what should have been a joyous celebration. Harold Morrison has chosen to make what should have been a private family matter into a public spectacle, and I feel compelled to provide some context." Judge Morrison started to step forward, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Let him talk," I said quietly. "Let everyone hear who he really is."
Richard nodded as if I'd made his point for him. "Sarah has always been challenging, From the time she was a small child, she's been prone to fantasy, to creating elaborate stories about her life that bear little resemblance to reality. This is simply another example of that pattern. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. I felt Judge Morrison tense beside me, but before he could speak, Marcus Webb stood up at table 7. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, his court reporter's voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "are you suggesting that Judge Morrison is lying about Sarah's parentage? Because that's a pretty serious accusation to make against a sitting member of the judiciary." Richard's smile was thin and sharp. "I'm suggesting that Harold has always had a complicated relationship with my wife. They dated briefly in college, and I think he's never quite gotten over that. This elaborate charade is simply his way of inserting himself into our family permanently." "Then you'll welcome a DNA test," Judge Morrison said calmly. "In fact, I had one done 3 months ago when I first started considering whether to tell Sarah the truth. The results are in my office safe, witnessed and notarized. Sarah's DNA matches mine with 99.97% certainty." The color drained from Richard's face. You had no right to test Sarah's DNA without her consent." "I used a sample from a water bottle she discarded at the community center, where I volunteer as a reading tutor for the adult literacy program," Judge Morrison replied smoothly. "Perfectly legal for paternity testing purposes. The sample was handled by the same lab the court system uses for custody cases. I can have the results here within an hour if you'd like to review them." I looked down at Richard, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. The desperate anger in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he processed the implications of irrefutable genetic evidence. He'd built his identity on being the magnanimous adoptive father who'd taken in another man's child, had used that narrative to justify years of emotional abuse disguised as high standards. What's challenging, Richard? What's challenging is spending 25 years trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it. What's challenging is believing that your own worth is determined by the approval of a man who saw you as nothing more than an unwelcome reminder of his wife's past. Mrs. Chen had made her way to the front of the crowd, her small form radiating indignation despite her age. "Richard Harrison," she said in her accented English, "you shame yourself and your family. This beautiful girl, she helped my grandson with homework when he struggled in school. She stay after community center close, work with him until he understand math problems. She never ask for money, never ask for recognition. What you do? You try to destroy her job, destroy her reputation." She shook her finger at him like a disappointed grandmother. "You bring dishonor to your own house." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I was amazed to realize how many people were nodding, how many faces showed support rather than shock or disapproval. Emma was crying again, but she was smiling too. Laura had climbed up onto the stage and taken my free hand, squeezing it tightly. "Sarah!" called out a voice from the back of the ballroom. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a pediatric surgeon who ran the hospital's child life program, was making her way forward. "Sarah, I don't think everyone here knows about the letter you wrote to our board last month." "What letter?" I asked, genuinely confused. Dr. Reeves smiled. "The letter nominating the community center's art program for our Community Partnership Award. You wrote 3 pages about how our social workers and your teaching methods could work together to help children cope with medical trauma through creative expression. The letter was so compelling, so thoughtfully constructed, that we're implementing a pilot program based entirely on your recommendations."
She turned to address Richard directly. "Mr. Harrison, your daughter identified a gap in our services that none of our medical professionals had recognized. She proposed a solution that's already showing remarkable results in our preliminary trials.
We're planning to expand the program to 3 other hospitals in the state. That's not the work of someone who will never amount to anything. That's the work of someone who sees solutions where the rest of us see problems. More voices joined in, people standing up throughout the ballroom to share their own experiences with me. Mrs. Patterson from the library talked about the reading program I'd helped establish for immigrant families. Tom Rodriguez from the food bank described the art therapy sessions I'd started for homeless veterans. Jennifer Walsh, a social worker, talked about how I'd helped her connect with a nonverbal autistic child through drawing exercises. With each testimony, Richard seemed to shrink, his earlier authority crumbling under the weight of evidence that contradicted everything he'd said about me. I watched him look around the ballroom, seeing perhaps for the first time how other people viewed his treatment of me. The disapproval was palpable, radiating from faces that had once shown him respect and deference. "Enough," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with desperation. "This is ridiculous. Sarah, you're making a spectacle of yourself again, just like you did when you dropped out of law school, just like you did when you quit the internship at my firm, just like you do every time you choose failure over success." "I didn't quit your internship," I said quietly, but the microphone carried my words to every corner of the ballroom. "You fired me. Do you remember why?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant. You fired me because I questioned a billing practice that was overcharging clients for paralegal work that I was doing as an unpaid intern. You fired me because I suggested that maybe the firm had an ethical obligation to provide accurate invoices." I looked out at the crowd, seeing the shocked expressions of Richard's business associates and legal colleagues. "You told me that ethics were a luxury that successful people couldn't afford." The silence was deafening. Judge Morrison's hand found mine, squeezing gently in support, but I was beyond needing his strength now. I was finding my own. "You want to know why I dropped out of law school, Richard? Because every time I came home excited about constitutional law or civil rights or pro bono work, you told me I was being naive. You said law school was about making connections and building wealth, not about justice or helping people. You made it clear that the kind of lawyer I wanted to be, the kind who works with families and children and people who need advocates, was the kind of lawyer you'd be embarrassed to claim as a daughter." Dr. Reeves was shaking her head in disgust. "Mr. Harrison, are you seriously suggesting that your daughter should be ashamed of wanting to help people? That she should have continued studying law just to make money rather than pursuing work that gives her life meaning?" "She could have been successful," Richard exploded, his careful composure finally cracking completely. "She could have had a real career, made real money, been someone important, instead of wasting her life on charity cases and other people's problems." "She is important." The voice came from an unexpected source, Miguel Santos, standing near the ballroom entrance with his mother. They were dressed in their best clothes, clearly not wedding guests, but somehow present nonetheless. Miguel stepped forward, his voice clear and strong despite his 12 years. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Sarah helped me write a poem about my grandmother's stories from Somalia. She said my words were beautiful, that they deserved to be heard. She helped me submit it to the youth poetry contest at the library, and I won first place. Nobody ever told me I was good at anything before Miss Sarah."
Chen's father, who spoke limited English but understood more than he let on, addressed Richard in carefully chosen words. "Your daughter, she see my son not as problem child, not as boy who no speak good English. She see artist. She see smart boy with big ideas. She make him proud of where he come from. You should be proud too." I was crying again, but these were different tears. Tears of recognition, of finally understanding my own value through the eyes of people who had never questioned it. The children from my program continued to speak, their parents translating when necessary, painting a picture of the woman I'd become when I wasn't looking through the lens of Richard's disapproval. Richard looked around the ballroom wildly, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. "This is absurd," he he said, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. "You're all being manipulated by Harold's grandstanding and Sarah's victim complex. She's a grown woman who can't support herself, who lives in a studio apartment and works part-time with children because she's afraid of real responsibility. She's 25 years old and she's already changed more lives than most people manage in a lifetime," Judge Morrison said, his voice cutting through Richard's protests like a blade. "She's built something meaningful from nothing, created programs that serve her community, earned the respect and love of colleagues who have no reason to lie for her." He stepped closer to the microphone, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Richard, you've spent this entire evening trying to diminish Sarah's accomplishments, to make her feel small and worthless. But look around this room. Look at the faces of people who know her work, who've seen her impact. You're the only person here who doesn't recognize her value." The truth of it was undeniable. Every face in the ballroom told the same story: respect, admiration, and genuine affection for the woman I'd become despite Richard's best efforts to break me. I saw it in Mrs. Chen's proud smile, in Dr. Reeves' approving nod, in the tears streaming down Laura's face as she squeezed my hand. "You know what I think, Richard?" I said, my voice steady and clear. "I think you're terrified that I might actually be happy. I think you've spent so many years telling me I was destined for failure that my success feels like a personal attack on everything you believe about worth and achievement and what makes a life valuable." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in my memory, he was speechless, undone by the simple truth of my observation. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his voice gentle but implacable. "Sarah, you don't have to decide about the adoption papers tonight. Take all the time you need to think about it, to process everything that's happened. But I want you to know, whether you choose to become my legal daughter or not, you will always be my child. You will always have my support, my love, and my absolute conviction that you are extraordinary exactly as you are." He turned to address the crowd one final time. "I apologize for disrupting this beautiful celebration, but I couldn't let another day pass without Sarah knowing the truth about her parentage and her worth. Now, I believe we have a wedding reception to continue." The string quartet, who had been waiting in stunned silence throughout the entire exchange, began playing again. Slowly, conversation resumed at the tables, though the energy had shifted completely. People were standing up, making their way toward the stage to speak with me, to offer congratulations and support. But Richard remained where he was, standing alone at the foot of the stage while his world rearranged itself around him. Finally, he looked up at me one last time. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible over the returning music, This isn't how I wanted things to go." I looked down at him, this Nan who had shaped my understanding of myself for 25 years, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, that would take time if it ever came at all, but a kind of clarity, a recognition that his cruelty had never been about me. "No, Richard," I said quietly. "This is exactly how you wanted things to go. You just never expected me to have witnesses." The line of people waiting to speak with me stretched across the ballroom like a receiving line at a royal wedding. One by one, community members I'd known for years approached the stage to share stories I'd never heard, acknowledgments I'd never received, validation I'd never known I needed.
Dr. Martinez, the director of the local women's shelter, was among the first. "Sarah, I don't think you realize how many of our residents have asked specifically for you when they need help with their children. Last month, Maria Santos, Miguel's aunt, she told me you were the only person who made her 6-year-old laugh after they left her abusive husband. That little girl hadn't smiled in weeks, but you sat with her and taught her to paint flowers, and suddenly she was giggling and chattering about colors and butterflies." Behind Dr. Martinez stood Father O'Brien from St. Catherine's, the Catholic church where I'd never been a member but had somehow become involved in their community outreach. "The food pantry volunteers have been asking me to thank you for months," he said, with his gentle Irish accent. "The way you organize the children's corner with books and art supplies and activities that keep the little ones busy while their parents shop, it's transformed the entire experience. Families actually look forward to coming now instead of dreading it." Each testimony was like a light switching on in a room I'd thought was empty. I had been so focused on Richard's disapproval that I'd never noticed how many other people had been watching, appreciating, valuing the work I did. The community center kids weren't my only impact. They were just the most visible part of a network of connection and care I'd built without even realizing it. Emma had made her way through the crowd and was standing beside the stage, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, do you remember when I was in med school and having panic attacks before every exam? You came over every Sunday for 6 months and made me dinner, helped me study, listened to me cry about how scared I was of failing." She looked around the ballroom, addressing the crowd as much as me. "You never once made me feel weak or broken. You just showed up, week after week, until I learned how to trust myself again." The memory hit me like a warm wave. Those Sunday evenings had been precious to me too. Cooking together in Emma's tiny apartment kitchen, quiz sessions that turned into philosophical discussions about medicine and ethics and what it meant to heal people. I thought I was just being a good cousin. I hadn't realized I was being a lifeline. Judge Morrison, my father, stood beside me through it all, his hand a steady presence on my shoulder as person after person painted a picture of the woman I'd become when I wasn't looking. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I could see him processing each story, each piece of evidence that his daughter had grown into exactly the person he'd hoped she would be. "Harold!" called out a voice from across the ballroom. District Attorney Rebecca Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, was making her way toward the stage with purpose in her step. "I need to speak with you privately." Judge Morrison frowned but nodded. "Sarah, will you be all right for a moment?" I looked around at the crowd of supporters, at Laura still holding my hand, at Emma standing guard beside the stage. "I think I'm going to be fine," I said, and for the first time in years, I actually believed it. Judge Morrison and Rebecca Chen moved to a quiet corner of the ballroom, their heads bent together in conversation. I could see the tension in their body language, the way Rebecca's hands moved as she explained something urgent and concerning. Meanwhile, Richard had retreated to the hotel bar, visible through the ballroom's French doors. He sat alone at the marble bar top, a whiskey neat in front of him, his shoulders curved in defeat. My stepmother, Catherine, hovered nearby, clearly torn between loyalty to her husband and the growing understanding that his behavior had been inexcusable. "Sarah," Catherine approached the stage tentatively, her face etched with confusion and regret, "I need to apologize to you. I've been blind to what was happening in our house, to how Richard treated you. I knew he was hard on you, but I told myself it was because he wanted you to succeed, wanted you to reach your potential." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "But listening to him tonight, hearing the cruelty in his words, there's no excuse for that. There's no excuse for the way he's tried to sabotage your career, your happiness, your sense of self-worth. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you." The apology was unexpected and deeply appreciated, but it also opened up questions I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. "Did you know," I asked quietly, "about Judge Morrison being my biological father?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I suspected. You and Harold have the same expressions, the same way of seeing the world. And your mother, she never talked about her past, but I could tell there was someone important she'd left behind. When Harold started showing up at our dinner parties after she died, when he took such interest in your education and activities," she shrugged helplessly, "I suspected, but I never asked. I thought maybe it was better not to know." "And Richard, did he suspect too?"
Oh, honey, Richard knew. He's always known. Catherine's voice was heavy with shame. He used to make comments about it when you weren't around, about how you looked like Harold, how you had Harold's stubborn streak and sense of justice. It ate at him, the idea that he was raising another man's child, that your mother had loved someone before him. The admission hit me like a physical blow. 25 years of conditional love, of constant criticism, of being made to feel like I was never enough, all because Richard couldn't forgive my mother for having a life before him. "I'm leaving him," Catherine said suddenly, the words spilling out in a rush. "I can't, after tonight, after seeing what he's done to you, I can't stay married to someone capable of such sustained cruelty." Laura agrees with me. She's horrified by her father's behavior. Before I could respond, Judge Morrison returned from his conversation with Rebecca Chen, his expression grave. "Sarah, we need to talk, privately." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through me. "What's wrong?"
Rebecca has been investigating some irregularities in Richard's business practices. Nothing related to you, he added quickly, seeing my alarm. But some of his recent behavior, the attempts to sabotage your career, the calls to your employers, they've raised some red flags about his judgment and his willingness to abuse his position for personal vendettas. Rebecca Chen stepped forward, her expression professional but sympathetic. Sarah, we've discovered that your father, Richard, has been using his business connections to try to have you blacklisted from potential employment opportunities throughout the city. He contacted the school district, the hospital system, even the university's continuing education program where you were considering taking classes. He told them you were unreliable, possibly struggling with substance abuse, definitely not someone they should consider hiring. The scope of Richard's sabotage was breathtaking. He hadn't just been passively disapproving of my choices. He'd been actively working to destroy my future opportunities, to ensure that his prophecy of my failure would become self-fulfilling. But there's more, Rebecca continued. In the process of investigating these calls, we discovered that Richard has been embezzling funds from the charitable foundation his firm manages. Small amounts over many years, but totaling nearly $500,000. My knees nearly buckled. $500,000? Preparing and narrating this story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The foundation provides scholarships for underprivileged students, grants for community programs, emergency assistance for families in crisis. Richard has been siphoning money from people who desperately needed it to fund his lifestyle, his business expenses, his country club memberships. The irony was staggering. While Richard had spent years telling me I was worthless for choosing community service over profit, he'd been stealing from the very communities I served. Judge Morrison's jaw was tight with anger. Rebecca, what's the timeline on charges? We'll be filing tomorrow morning. Fraud, embezzlement, possibly federal charges depending on how the money moved between accounts. Richard Harrison's law license will be suspended pending investigation, and his assets will be frozen until we can determine the full extent of the theft. I looked across the ballroom at Richard, still sitting alone at the bar, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. For a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. Then I thought about the families he'd robbed, the students who'd been denied scholarships, the community programs that had been underfunded while he played golf at his exclusive club. Sarah, Rebecca said gently, I want you to know that none of this reflects on you. In fact, your work at the community center, your reputation for integrity and service, it's going to help us rebuild trust in the foundation once we remove Richard from any involvement. What do you mean? Judge Morrison smiled, though his expression remained serious. The Foundation's board has asked if you'd consider joining as a community liaison, helping to identify programs and individuals who deserve support. It's a paid position, not enough to make you rich, but enough to provide financial stability while you continue your work at the community center. The offer was overwhelming, coming on top of everything else that had happened in the past hour. A legitimate connection to philanthropy, a chance to help direct resources to the people and programs I cared about most. It felt like the universe was conspiring to prove Richard wrong in the most spectacular way possible.
I need time to think about all of this, I said, looking around the ballroom that had become the stage for the most important moments of my life. The adoption, the foundation position, the trust fund, it's a lot to process. Of course, Judge Morrison said, his voice warm with understanding. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, I want you to know you don't have to earn any of this. You don't have to prove your worth or justify your choices. You've already done that. Every day in 100 small ways that add up to something extraordinary. Laura appeared at my side, having finally broken free from well-wishers and wedding guests. Sarah, honey, are you okay? This is supposed to be my wedding day, but all I can think about is how happy I am that the truth finally came out. She hugged me tightly, her wedding dress rustling around us. I've always known you were special,
But seeing everyone here tonight, hearing all these stories, I'm so proud to be your sister."
"Stepsister," I corrected automatically, the old habit still strong. "Sister," she said firmly. "Biology doesn't make family. Love does. And I've loved you like a sister since the day our parents got married. That's never going to change, no matter what happens with Harold's adoption papers or Dad's legal troubles or any of the rest of it." The music had started again, and couples were returning to the dance floor. The wedding reception was resuming, though the energy had shifted completely. Instead of the polite, formal atmosphere of earlier, there was now a sense of celebration that felt deeper, more genuine. People were talking excitedly, sharing stories, connecting over shared appreciation for work that mattered more than profit margins. Mrs. Chen made her way over to me, moving slowly but purposefully. "Sarah, dear girl, I want to tell you a story. When I come to America 50 years ago, I speak no English, know nothing about how things work here. Your community center, they help me learn language, help me understand forms for citizenship, for Social Security. Without that help, I maybe never become American citizen." She paused, her eyes bright with memories. "Programs like yours, they save lives. Not dramatic save, not like doctor or firefighter. But they save lives by making people feel human, by teaching children they matter, by showing families they belong in this country. Your work is holy work. Never let anyone tell you different." The word holy resonated through me like a struck bell. I'd never thought of my work in religious terms. I wasn't particularly devout, had always been more comfortable with questions than with answers. But there was something sacred about witnessing a child discover their own creativity, about helping a family navigate systems designed to exclude them, about creating spaces where people could be fully themselves without judgment or conditions. "Thank you," I whispered, squeezing Mrs. Chen's hands. "Thank you for seeing me." "We all see you, dear. Richard, he blind by his own hurt, his own fear. But the rest of us, we see you clear." As the evening wore on, the initial shock of the revelations began to settle into something like wonder. People continued to approach me, some sharing their own stories of my impact on their lives, others simply offering congratulations and support. The children from the community center had been allowed to stay for cake and dancing, and seeing them in their best clothes, spinning on the dance floor with infectious joy, reminded me why I'd chosen this work in the first place. Miguel found me during a quiet moment, his small hand tugging on my bridesmaid dress. "Miss Sarah, is it true? Are you going to be rich now?" I knelt down to his level, thinking about how to explain trust funds and adoption and family complications to an 8-year-old. "I might have more money than I used to, Miguel, but that doesn't change anything important. I'm still going to be at the community center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm still going to help you with your art projects. I'm still going to be me." He nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin. "Good, because I'm working on a painting of my family for the art show next month, and I need you to help me mix the right color for my mama's skin." The art show. I'd forgotten about our spring exhibition, where the kids would display their work for their families and the broader community. It would happen whether I was rich or poor, whether I was Sarah Harrison or Sarah Morrison, whether Harold approved or not. The work would continue because it mattered, because the children mattered, because beauty and creativity and human connection were valuable in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or status.
"I'll be there," I promised Miguel, "and we'll make that painting perfect." As he ran back to the dance floor, I felt Judge Morrison's presence beside me. "Penny for your thoughts," he said quietly. I looked around the ballroom, at Laura dancing with her new husband, at Emma deep in conversation with Dr. Reeves about pediatric art therapy, at Catherine comforting Mrs. Chen, at Richard still sitting alone at the bar with the weight of his coming reckoning. I was thinking about how different everything looks now, I said. This morning, I woke up as Sarah Harrison, retail worker and part-time art teacher, daughter of a man who thought I was a failure. Tonight, I'm gonna sleep as... who? Sarah Morrison? Sarah Harrison Morrison? Someone with a trust fund and a biological father who loves me and a community that values my work? You're going to sleep as Sarah, Judge Morrison said simply. The same Sarah who got up this morning with compassion in her heart and dedication to her community. The same Sarah who's been building something beautiful and meaningful for years, with or without recognition. The money, the name, the legal papers, they're just external validation of what was always true. He paused, watching the dancers spin across the polished floor. Your mother would be so proud of who you've become. She used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they achieved for themselves, but what they made possible for others. By that measure, Sarah, you're already everything she hoped you'd be. The tears came again, but these were different. Tears of recognition. A finally understanding that I'd been enough all along. I just needed the right witnesses to see it. The week following Laura's wedding passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and media attention that I was entirely unprepared for. Apparently, a prominent judge publicly claiming paternity and exposing embezzlement at a charity foundation was the kind of story that local news stations found irresistible. I found myself fielding interview requests, dodging photographers outside my studio apartment, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my entire world restructured itself around me. The community center became my refuge. Janet Morrison, no relation to Judge Harold Morrison, though she found the coincidence amusing, kept reporters away from the building and made sure the children's routines weren't disrupted by the circus surrounding their art teacher's sudden notoriety. Sarah, Janet said on the Thursday after the wedding, finding me in the art room where I was preparing materials for the afternoon session, I need to talk to you about something important. I looked up from the watercolor paints I was organizing, noting the serious expression on her face. Is this about the reporters? Because I promise I'm doing everything I can to keep them away from the kids. It's not about the reporters. Janet closed the door behind her and took a seat on one of the small plastic chairs designed for 8-year-olds. I've been in meetings with the board all week, and we want to offer you the position of program director for community arts and family services. My stomach dropped. You're firing me? What? No, Sarah, no, absolutely not. Janet leaned forward, her expression earnest. The opposite, actually. I've been in meetings with the board all week, and we want to offer you the position of program director for community arts and family services. I stared at her, trying to process the words. Program director? Full-time position, Sarah. $40,000 a year plus benefits with the authority to expand our arts programming, develop new community partnerships, and supervise a team of part-time instructors and volunteers. Janet smiled. The board was already impressed with your work, but after last week's, revelations about your background and the recognition you've been receiving from other organizations, they realized we'd be crazy not to promote you. $40,000 a year. More than I'd ever earned. Enough to move out of the studio apartment. Enough to stop worrying about whether I could afford groceries and gas in the same week. But I don't have a degree in social work or nonprofit management. You have something better, Janet interrupted. You have 5 years of experience actually doing the work, building relationships with families, creating programs that serve real needs in our community. You have the trust of the children and parents we serve. You have partnerships with organizations throughout the city. She gestured around the art room, which had been transformed over the years from a stark institutional space into something warm and welcoming.
Sarah, you've basically been doing this job already. We're just making it official and paying you what you're worth. The offer was overwhelming.
coming on top of the trust fund revelation and the adoption papers still sitting on my kitchen table, unsigned but carefully considered each morning over coffee. I'd been existing in a strange limbo all week, afraid to make any permanent changes until the dust settled from Richard's arrest and the investigation into the foundation's missing funds. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course. But don't think too long. The board is meeting next Tuesday to finalize the budget for next fiscal year, and I'd like to include your salary in the approved expenses." That afternoon's art session was particularly special. The kids had heard fragments of information about the wedding weekend. Miguel's family had been invited to witness Judge Morrison's announcement, and news traveled fast in our tight-knit community. But they understood it in the uncomplicated way that children do. Miss Sarah's real dad had found her, and now she was happy. Miss Sarah Aisha said while working on a portrait of her grandmother, "My mom says you might be rich now. Does that mean you won't want to teach us anymore?" The question came from pure innocence, but it cut straight to the heart of my deepest fear. "Aisha, honey, why would having money make me not want to spend time with you?" She shrugged, her brush pausing mid-stroke. "My cousin Marcus, when his dad got a better job and they moved to the nice neighborhood, he said he couldn't hang out with us anymore because we weren't his kind of people." I set down my own paintbrush and looked around the room at the dozen children working on their projects. Chen was teaching another boy how to draw perspective. 2 girls were collaborating on a mural about their favorite books. Miguel was carefully adding details to his family portrait, the one he'd been working on for weeks. "Listen, all of you," I said, raising my voice slightly to get everyone's attention. "I need you to understand something important. No matter what happens with money or adoption papers or fancy job titles, this room, this work, all of you, you're not something I do until something better comes along. You're the best thing in my life. You're the reason I wake up excited on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You're what makes everything else worthwhile." The children nodded solemnly, though I could see some skepticism in their expressions. They'd been disappointed by adults before, had learned not to trust promises too quickly. "I'll prove it to you," I said impulsively. "The art show is in 3 weeks, right? What if we made it bigger this year? What if we invited the whole community? Set up displays in the main gymnasium, had an opening reception like a real gallery?" Their faces lit up with excitement, and suddenly the room was buzzing with ideas and questions and ambitious plans. As we talked through possibilities, displaying work on easels borrowed from the high school, preparing artist statements to hang beside each piece, maybe even having a small catalog printed, I felt something settle into place inside me. This was who I was. This was what I was meant to do. The trust fund and the adoption papers and the foundation position were wonderful opportunities, but they were also distractions from the essential truth. I'd already found my calling, already built something meaningful, already become the person I was supposed to be. That evening, I called Judge Morrison and asked if he could meet me for dinner. We chose a quiet restaurant downtown far enough from my neighborhood to avoid the reporters who still occasionally staked out my apartment building. "You look better," he said as we settled into a corner booth, less shell-shocked. I laughed. "I feel like I'm finally starting to process everything. It's been quite a week." "Indeed it has. I've been worried about you, thrown into all this chaos without any preparation. I should have handled the revelation more carefully, given you time to adjust privately before making it public."
"No," I said firmly. "You were right to do it the way you did. If you'd told me privately, I might have asked you to keep it secret. I was so used to protecting Richard's image, so conditioned to avoid conflict, that I probably would have convinced myself it was better for everyone if nothing changed." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" "Now I understand that secrets protect the wrong people. Richard spent years making me feel ashamed of who I was, and I helped him by keeping quiet about how he treated me. But seeing everyone's reaction at the wedding, hearing all those stories about how my work has mattered to people, I realized I'd been complicit in my own diminishment.
We ordered our meals, comfort food for both of us, the kind of simple dinner that felt appropriate for processing life-changing revelations. As we waited for our food, I pulled out the adoption papers I'd been carrying in my purse all week. "I've been reading these every day," I said, smoothing the legal documents on the table between us, trying to understand what it would mean to legally become Sarah Morrison instead of Sarah Harrison. "And what have you concluded?" "That it wouldn't change who I am, but it might change how I see myself." I looked up at him, this man who'd been a constant, gentle presence in my life without me ever understanding why. I've spent 25 years believing that love had to be earned, that I had to prove myself worthy of affection and respect. But you've been loving me unconditionally all this time, haven't you? Even when you couldn't claim me, even when you had to watch from a distance. Judge Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "Every day, Sarah. Every single day. When you were 8 and won the school art contest, I was so proud I kept a copy of the winning drawing in my desk drawer for years. When you graduated high school, I wanted to throw you a party, but had to content myself with anonymously donating to the scholarship fund in your name. When you started working at the community center, I felt like my heart might burst with pride at the woman you'd become." The waiter brought our food, but neither of us moved to eat. The conversation felt too important, too fragile to interrupt with something as mundane as dinner. "I want to sign them," I said quietly. "Not because I need your name or your money or your legal validation, but because I want the world to know that I'm your daughter by choice as well as by biology. I want Richard to understand that rejecting me was his loss, not my failing. And I want you to know that having you as my father, officially, legally, permanently, would be the honor of my lifetime." Judge Morrison reached across the table and took my hands, his grip warm and strong. "Sarah Morrison," he said, testing the sound of it. "It suits you." "There's something else," I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. "I want to accept the job at the community center. Full-time program director. I want to expand the arts programming, develop partnerships with other organizations, maybe even start a scholarship program for kids who want to pursue creative careers but can't afford the training." "That sounds wonderful. And the foundation position?" "I want to do that too, but as a volunteer board member rather than paid staff. I want to help direct resources to community programs, but I don't want it to take me away from direct service. The kids at the center, the families we work with, that's where I belong." Judge Morrison smiled, and I saw in his expression the same pride I'd been craving from Richard all these years. But this pride felt different, unconditional, supportive, based on genuine appreciation for who I was, rather than expectations of who I should become. "What about the trust fund?" he asked gently. "I've been thinking about that a lot. $250,000 is more money than I ever imagined having, but it doesn't feel entirely mine. It feels like a gift from my grandmother, channeled through you, meant to support the work I'm already doing." I paused, considering my words carefully. "I want to use part of it to buy a house. Nothing fancy, but something stable, maybe with space for a home studio where I can work on my own art. The rest, I want to invest in an endowment for community arts programming. Something permanent that will support programs like mine long after I'm gone." "Sarah," Judge Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to give the money away to prove you're worthy of it. Your grandmother left it to you because she believed in the person you would become. She wanted you to have security, options, the freedom to pursue meaningful work without worrying about basic needs." "I know, and that's exactly what I'm doing with it. The house will give me security, the endowment will give other people the chance to pursue meaningful work, and keeping enough for myself to live comfortably while doing what I love, that's the freedom she wanted me to have."
We finally started eating, though the conversation continued between bites. Judge Morrison told me more about my grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, a woman I'd never met, but who had apparently been following my progress through carefully maintained connections to my mother and, later, to Judge Morrison himself.
She was an artist too, he said, showing me a photograph on his phone. Painted landscapes, mostly. She would have loved your work with the children, your belief in the transformative power of creativity. The photograph showed a woman in her 70s, standing in front of an easel in a sun-drenched studio. She had my eyes, the same green shade that had marked me as different in a family of brown-eyed people. Seeing her face was like looking at a roadmap of genetic inheritance I'd never had access to before. She left you something else, Judge Morrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Something I've been keeping until the right moment. He pulled out a small velvet box and placed it on the table between us. Inside was a simple gold locket, delicate and vintage, with an intricate pattern of flowers etched into its surface. When I opened it, I found 2 photographs, one of my mother as a young woman laughing at something outside the frame, and one of my grandmother at the easel, paintbrush in hand, completely absorbed in her work. She had that made for you when you were born, Judge Morrison explained. She wanted you to know where you came from, to understand that creativity and compassion were your birthright. Your mother kept it for you, planning to give it to you when you turned 18, but she died when I was 15, I finished, fastening the locket around my neck. It settled against my collarbone like it had been waiting 25 years to find its home. The weight of it was comforting, a physical reminder of the women who had loved me before I even knew they existed. Looking at their faces, my mother's joy, my grandmother's concentration, I could see myself reflected in their expressions, could understand for the first time that my love of art, my instinct for nurturing, my belief in the importance of beauty and creativity weren't character flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be treasured. We spent another hour at dinner talking about practical matters, signing the adoption papers, transferring the trust fund, coordinating with the community center board about my new position. But beneath the logistics was a deeper conversation about identity, family, and the courage it takes to claim your own worth in a world that often seems determined to diminish it. As we prepared to leave, Judge Morrison reached across the table one more time. Sarah, I want you to know something. The man you've become in spite of Richard's treatment, the woman you've grown into through your own strength and determination, you didn't need my validation or acknowledgement to be worthy of love and respect. You've always been enough, exactly as you are. I know that now, I said, and I realized it was true. The wedding reception had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had been happening slowly, invisibly, through years of children's laughter and parents' gratitude and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. The next morning, I woke up early and walked to the community center before my official workday began. The building was quiet, empty except for the janitor who nodded at me as he finished mopping the main hallway. I let myself into the art room and stood among the easels and supply cabinets, the bulletin boards covered with children's work, the windows that looked out onto the playground where kids would soon be running and laughing. This was my kingdom, small but mighty, built not with money or status, but with patience and paint and the radical belief that every child deserved to see their own creativity reflected back to them as something valuable. In a few hours, Janet would arrive, and I would officially accept the position of program director. By evening, the adoption papers would be signed and filed with the court, and by the end of the month, I would have a new name, a new home, and a formal role in directing charitable funds to programs throughout the city.
But right now, in the early morning quiet of an empty art room, I was simply Sarah, daughter, teacher, artist, community member. The same person I'd been a week ago, but finally seen clearly, finally understood as enough. Miguel's family portrait sat on the counter where he'd left it the day before, nearly finished and absolutely beautiful. His mother's skin was exactly the right shade of brown, mixed with careful attention to the subtle variations in color and light that made her face come alive on paper. Looking at it, I felt the familiar surge of pride and wonder that came from witnessing a child discover their own capability, their own vision, their own voice. This was why I was here. This was what mattered. This was the measure of a life well lived, Not in dollars earned or status achieved, but in moments of connection, in growth fostered, in beauty created and shared. I was enough. I had always been enough. And now, finally, I knew it. 3 months later, the spring air carried the scent of blooming cherry trees through the open windows of what was now officially called the Morrison Community Art Center. The renamed building gleamed with fresh paint, a warm yellow that the children had chosen through a democratic voting process, and bustled with activity that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. I stood in my new office, reviewing applications for the Summer Arts Intensive program that had grown from an ambitious dream to a fully funded reality in less than 12 weeks. 25 children would spend 6 weeks creating murals, learning photography, exploring theater, and working with professional artists who'd volunteered their time after hearing about our expanded programming. A knock on my door interrupted my review. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Janet or one of the program assistants we'd hired to help manage our growing roster of activities. Instead, Richard walked in. He looked different, older somehow, diminished. The confident bearing that had defined him for as long as I'd known him had been replaced by something more tentative, uncertain. His expensive suits had given way to khakis and a polo shirt, the kind of casual attire he'd once dismissed as unprofessional. "Hello, Sarah," he said, hovering near the doorway as if unsure whether he was welcome. "Richard," I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my voice carefully neutral. "Sit, please." He settled into the chair, his hands folding and unfolding in his lap, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from him before. "I wanted to thank you," he said, after a moment of uncomfortable silence. "Thank me?" "For not pressing charges, for asking the Foundation Board to focus on restitution rather than additional legal penalties." He looked around my office, taking in the children's artwork that covered every wall, the photographs of community events, the certificates and awards that had accumulated since the center's expansion. "Rebecca Chen told me you advocated for a settlement that would avoid jail time if I paid back everything I'd taken plus interest." I did indeed speak to the Foundation Board on his behalf, though not out of lingering affection or forgiveness. "I did it for Laura and Catherine," I said honestly. "They've been through enough, and I thought your skills might be better used helping to rebuild what you damaged rather than sitting in a prison cell." He nodded, his expression pained but accepting. "The community service requirement, 500 hours of pro bono legal work for nonprofit organizations, it's been educational." "In what way?" "I'm working with the Immigrant Rights Coalition now, helping families navigate citizenship applications, asylum cases, deportation proceedings. Yesterday, I spent 4 hours with a woman whose husband was detained by ICE while walking to his job at a restaurant. She has 3 children, no income, and was facing eviction because she couldn't make rent without his wages." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I was able to get her husband released on bond, helped her apply for emergency assistance, connected her with job training programs. When she hugged me and cried because I'd kept her family together, I don't think anyone has ever been that grateful for anything I've done in my entire career."
The revelation was startling. Not because Richard had been capable of helping, he'd always been skilled at navigating complex legal systems, but because he seemed genuinely moved by the experience. "That's good work," I said, meaning it. "Important work." "It's work you've been doing all along, isn't it? In different ways, with different tools, but the same essential mission, helping people who need advocates, who need someone to see their worth when the world tells them they don't matter." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving rhetoric, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse and recognition. "Yes," I said simply, "that's what this work is about." "Sarah, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the kind of hollow statement lawyers make to avoid liability. I owe you an acknowledgement of how badly I failed you,
how much damage I did to someone who deserved nothing but love and support. The words I'd wanted to hear for 25 years hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. "Go on," I said quietly. "I was jealous," Richard said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Jealous of Harold, of what he'd shared with your mother before I met her. Jealous of you, even, because you represented a part of her life that had nothing to do with me. I convinced myself that by diminishing you, I was protecting my own place in the family, asserting my importance as the man who'd actually raised you. But the truth is, you never needed raising. You raised yourself with your mother's values and Harold's sense of justice and something entirely your own that neither of them could have given you. You became exactly who you were supposed to become, in spite of my efforts to make you smaller." The apology was more complete, more insightful than anything I'd expected from Richard. It didn't erase 25 years of damage, didn't automatically repair the relationship between us, but it was a beginning. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "It helps to hear you acknowledge what happened, to know that you understand the impact of your choices." "Is there any chance—" he began, then stopped himself. "No, I'm sorry. I have no right to ask for forgiveness or relationship or anything else from you. I just wanted you to know that I see you now. I see what you've built here, what you mean to this community, how wrong I was about everything that matters." Before I could respond, the sound of children's voices filled the hallway outside my office. The afternoon program was starting, and 23 kids between the ages of 6 and 14 were making their way to various activity rooms throughout the building. "Miss Sarah," Miguel's voice called through my door, "are you coming to see my sculpture today?" "I'll be right there," I called back, then turned to Richard. "I need to go. The kids are expecting me." Richard nodded and stood up. "Of course, I don't want to keep you from your work." He paused at the door. "Sarah, would it be all right if I made a donation to the center? A significant one, not as an attempt to buy forgiveness, but as an investment in what you're doing here?" I considered the offer, weighing my personal feelings against the practical needs of the programs we were trying to build. "Talk to Janet about it," I said finally. "She handles all the major gift discussions. But Richard, any donation comes with no expectations of recognition or relationship with me. It would be anonymous and unconditional." "Understood. And Sarah, I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to claim any credit for who you've become, but I'm proud of you anyway." After he left, I sat in my office for a few minutes, processing the conversation and what it might mean for the complicated web of family relationships that defined my life. Richard's apology had been more thorough than I'd expected, his recognition of my work more genuine than I'd thought possible. It didn't erase 25 years of damage, didn't automatically repair the relationship between us, but it was a beginning.
Miguel appeared in my doorway, his 8-year-old face bright with excitement. "Miss Sarah, you have to come see what I made. It's a sculpture of my whole family, including my new baby sister, and I used the clay techniques you taught me to make all the different textures for hair and clothes and everything." I followed him down the hallway to the main art studio, where the walls now displayed a rotating exhibition of student work that changed monthly. The space had tripled in size since my promotion, expanding into 2 adjacent rooms that allowed for different age groups to work simultaneously on various projects. Miguel's sculpture was indeed impressive. 6 figures arranged around a miniature table, each one carefully detailed and expressive. His baby sister was wrapped in a tiny clay blanket, her face peaceful in sleep. His mother held a tiny clay coffee cup, her expression warm and welcoming. His father wore work clothes that Miguel had textured to look like denim and canvas. "Miguel, this is absolutely beautiful," I said, crouching down to examine the piece more closely. "Look at how you captured your father's work boots. I can see every lace and crease. And your sister's little hand poking out of her blanket? That's exactly how babies sleep, isn't it?
He beamed with pride, then leaned closer to point out details I might have missed. See how I made my mom's hair curly? I rolled little pieces of clay and then attached them one by one. And my dad's mustache? I had to make it 3 times before I got the shape right. Other children gathered around to admire Miguel's work and share their own projects. Aisha had written and illustrated a short story about her grandmother's journey from Somalia to America. Chen had created a photographic series documenting the different languages spoken in our neighborhood, with portraits of families next to words written in Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin, and English. 12-year-old Marcus, Mrs. Chen's grandson, had composed and recorded a song about missing his friends in California while learning to love his new home. Each project represented hours of patient work, moments of frustration overcome, breakthroughs achieved through persistence and encouragement. But more than that, each piece represented a child's growing understanding that their voice mattered, that their perspective had value, that their creativity was worth nurturing and celebrating. "Miss Sarah," Aisha said, holding up her finished storybook, "my mom wants to know if you think I should submit this to that writing contest at the library, the one for middle school students?" "Absolutely," I said, without hesitation. "This story is powerful and beautifully written. You have a real gift for helping readers understand experiences that might be different from their own." As the afternoon session wound down, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The adoption papers had been finalized 6 weeks earlier in a simple ceremony in Judge Morrison's chambers, with Laura and Emma as witnesses, and Catherine offering her blessing, despite her own complicated feelings about the family restructuring. The trust fund had enabled me to buy a small house just 10 blocks from the community center, a 1920s bungalow with hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a sunroom that I'd converted into a home studio. For the first time in my adult life, I had space to create my own art alongside the work I did with the children. The foundation position had evolved into something more collaborative and community-focused than I had initially envisioned. Rather than simply directing grants from a boardroom, I spent time visiting programs throughout the city, talking with directors and participants, identifying needs that traditional funding sources might overlook. 6 months later, the first Morrison Community Arts Festival transformed downtown into a celebration of creativity that drew nearly 3,000 visitors over 2 days. Local businesses sponsored booths where children demonstrated pottery techniques, printmaking, photography, and mural painting. The high school jazz band provided background music while families strolled between displays of student artwork from programs throughout the city.
I stood on the main stage, looking out at the crowd gathered in the town square, preparing to introduce the keynote speaker for the festival's closing ceremony. Judge Morrison, my father, sat in the front row with Catherine and Laura, all of them beaming with pride as they watched me step up to the microphone. "When I was 8 years old," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I painted a picture of my family that included a dog we didn't have, a garden my mother had never planted, and a father figure who looked nothing like the man who'd adopted me. My art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, hung it in the hallway anyway and told me it was beautiful because it showed what I hoped for, not just what existed." The crowd quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward the stage with expressions of interest and attention. That painting was the first time I understood that art doesn't just reflect reality, it can envision possibility. It can imagine worlds where families are complete, where children feel safe, where communities support each other's dreams. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces that now included so many families I'd worked with over the years. Today, I want to talk about the difference between success and significance, and why understanding that difference might be the most important lesson we can teach our children.
I spoke for 15 minutes about the kids whose work surrounded us, about the parents who'd discovered their own creativity through family art classes, about the businesses and organizations that had partnered with us to create opportunities for young people to explore career paths in creative fields. Success, as our culture typically defines it, is about individual achievement, what you earn, what you own, what status you attain. But significance is about connection, what you contribute, what you make possible for others, what legacy you leave in the hearts and minds of people whose lives you've touched. McGill, now 9, and serving as a junior volunteer at the festival, was helping demonstrate pottery techniques at a booth near the stage. His family sculpture had won first place in the state youth arts competition and was now on permanent display at the community center. More importantly, his confidence in his own abilities had grown to the point where he was teaching younger children the techniques I'd taught him. The children in our community arts programs aren't just learning to paint or write or sing. They're learning to see themselves as people whose voices matter, whose perspectives have value, whose creativity is worth nurturing. They're learning that they don't have to choose between following their dreams and serving their communities. They can do both. As I concluded my remarks and introduced the evening's musical performances, I felt a deep sense of completeness that had nothing to do with external recognition or financial security. The work we were doing mattered. The children we served were thriving. The community we'd built was sustainable and growing. 1 year later. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with elegant calligraphy. The mayor's office and city council request your presence at the dedication of Morrison Square, honoring Judge Harold Morrison and Sarah Morrison for their exceptional service to our community's families and children. I stared at the invitation, trying to process the magnitude of what it represented. A public square named after my father and me, recognizing not just our individual contributions, but our partnership in supporting community development and family services. The dedication ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, with speeches from the mayor, the school superintendent, and representatives of a dozen organizations that had benefited from foundation grants over the past year. But the most meaningful moment came when Miguel, now 10 and articulate beyond his years, stepped up to the podium to speak on behalf of all the children served by community programs. "Before I met Miss Sarah," he said, his voice clear and confident, "I thought art was something that other people did. Rich kids, smart kids, kids whose parents could pay for lessons. But Miss Sarah taught me that art is for everyone, that creativity lives inside all of us, that we just need someone to help us find it and encourage us to share it."
He paused, looking directly at me in the front row of folding chairs set up around the small park that would now bear our family name. Miss Sarah didn't just teach me how to mix colors or shape clay. She taught me that I matter, that my ideas are worth listening to, that I can make beautiful things that help other people feel less alone in the world. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was seeing Miguel's parents in the crowd, their faces glowing with pride for their son's poise and eloquence. This was what success looked like, not individual achievement, but shared growth, community strength, collective recognition of everyone's inherent worth. 2 years later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to my office at the community center by a courier service I'd never heard of. The return address was Stanford University's School of Education, and the contents changed everything I thought I knew about my own possibilities. "Dear Miss Morrison," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the recipient of this year's National Community Education Innovation Award, recognizing your pioneering work in arts-based family services and community development. The award includes a $100,000 grant to support expansion of your programming model, as well as an invitation to spend a semester as a visiting scholar at Stanford, developing curriculum for training community educators nationwide." I read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered.
national recognition for work I'd stumbled into by following my heart, an invitation to share what I'd learned with educators across the country, resources to expand programming beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. But even more significant than the external recognition was what I felt reading those words: complete alignment between who I was and what I was doing, total integration of my values and my work, absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. 5 years later, the documentary filmmaker had been following our program for 6 months, capturing the daily rhythms of community life that had grown up around the Morrison Arts Center. She was particularly interested in the longitudinal impact of arts programming on child development and family stability, tracking kids like Miguel, who was now 15, and teaching art to elementary students while maintaining a 4.0 GPA and planning to study community development in college. "What do you think makes this program different?" she asked during one of our interview sessions, her camera crew capturing the late afternoon light streaming through the studio windows. I considered the question while watching Aisha, now 17 and a senior in high school, work with a group of 6-year-olds on a mural about community helpers. She moved between the children with patience and enthusiasm, helping them mix colors and encouraging their ideas while gently guiding their technique. "I think it's the recognition that everyone has something to contribute," I said finally. "We don't approach this work with a deficit model. We don't assume that children from low-income families or immigrant families or families facing challenges need us to fix them. We assume they have wisdom and creativity and perspectives that can teach us as much as we can teach them." The filmmaker nodded, then asked the question I'd been expecting. "Your father's initial rejection of your career choices, the public confrontation at your stepsister's wedding, how did that experience shape your approach to working with families?" "It taught me that the stories we tell about people matter enormously," I said, thinking about Richard, who now volunteered regularly at the Immigrant Rights Coalition and had developed genuine friendships with several families he'd helped. Richard spent years telling a story about me that emphasized my limitations rather than my strengths. But the community told a different story, one that recognized my contributions and potential. The children and parents I work with have often heard limiting stories about themselves, too. Our job is to help them discover and share their own stories of strength and possibility.
The young woman sitting across from my desk reminded me of myself at 25. Uncertain, seeking, convinced that her passion for community service somehow made her less valuable than her peers pursuing traditional careers in business or finance. "I just don't know if I'm making the right choice," she said, twisting her hands in her lap. "My parents keep asking when I'm going to get a real job, and sometimes I wonder if they're right. Maybe I should go back to school for business or law or something more practical." I leaned back in my chair, looking at Lisa Chen, Marcus's older sister, now graduated from college with a degree in social work and considering a position with our family services program. The conversation felt like an echo of discussions I'd had with dozens of young adults over the years, all of them struggling with the same fundamental question. Is it possible to build a meaningful life around service to others? "Lisa, can I tell you something? 10 years ago, I was living in a studio apartment, working part-time, convinced that everyone else had figured out some secret to success that I'd missed. I thought my desire to work with children and families was a character flaw, a sign that I wasn't ambitious enough to pursue real success." She looked up at me with interest, and I could see some of her tension beginning to ease. But what I've learned is that there are many different ways to measure a life well lived. Financial security matters. You need to be able to support yourself, to have stability and options. But beyond meeting your basic needs, the question becomes, what do you want your life to stand for? What legacy do you want to leave? What kind of impact do you want to have on the world around you? Through my office window, I could see the playground where children from our after-school program were playing during their break from homework help. Miguel, now 20, and a junior at the State University, was leading a group of 8-year-olds in a game that seemed to involve both soccer and elaborate storytelling.
Miguel started in our program when he was 8 years old. His family was struggling financially. His parents worked multiple jobs, and he was falling behind in school because no one had time to help him with homework. Now he's studying community development and education, planning to start his own nonprofit focused on rural arts programming. He credits his experience here with showing him that he could be both successful and service-oriented. Lisa nodded, but I could see she was still wrestling with doubt. But what about money? What about security? I have student loans, and my parents sacrificed so much to send me to college. Those are legitimate concerns, I acknowledged. But let me ask you this. What would it cost you to spend the next 40 years doing work that felt meaningless? What would it cost your family, your community, your own sense of integrity if you chose security over purpose? I pulled out a folder from my desk drawer and showed her our salary structure, our benefits package, our professional development opportunities. This position starts at $45,000 a year, with full health insurance, retirement contributions, and support for continuing education. It's not going to make you wealthy, but it's enough to live comfortably while doing work that matters. And, Lisa, if you're good at this work, if you're passionate about it, dedicated to it, there are opportunities for growth, for leadership, for eventually starting your own programs or organizations. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical concerns about career development, loan repayment, and family expectations. But the turning point came when I showed her letters from program participants, parents describing how family art therapy had helped them communicate with their teenagers, children writing about how creative expression had helped them process trauma, community members explaining how arts programming had brought neighbors together across cultural and linguistic barriers. This is the impact you'd be having, I said as she read through the testimonials. These are the lives you'd be touching, the families you'd be supporting, the community you'd be building. That's not a consolation prize for people who can't succeed in traditional careers. That's the most important work there is. 15 years later. The invitation to speak at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government was simultaneously thrilling and surreal. The topic was community-based solutions to social inequality, and I was being asked to share what we'd learned in our small city with policymakers and academics who influenced social programs nationwide.
15 years ago, I began. I was working part-time at a small community center, teaching art to children whose families couldn't afford formal arts education. I thought of myself as someone who'd failed to achieve traditional success, a law school dropout working with charity cases, in the words of someone who once claimed to love me. A ripple of sympathetic attention moved through the audience. Today, that small program has become a model replicated in over 40 cities across 12 states. We've served more than 8,000 children and their families, developed partnerships with major universities and healthcare systems, and influenced policy at state and federal levels. But more importantly, we've proven something that academics and policymakers have long suspected but struggled to implement, that communities have the wisdom and resources to solve their own problems if we create the right conditions for that wisdom to emerge. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a photograph of our current facility, which now occupied an entire city block and included art studios, performance spaces, job training facilities, and family counseling services. The key insight that transformed our work was the recognition that families experiencing challenges aren't broken systems that need fixing. They're complex, resilient communities that need support, resources, and recognition of their existing strengths. I advanced to the next slide, showing data about educational outcomes, family stability, and community engagement among our program participants. When we approach social services from an asset-based perspective, when we assume that people are experts on their own lives and communities, the results are dramatically different from traditional deficit-based interventions. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering everything from funding models to staff training to partnership development. But the questions during the Q&A session focused on something more fundamental.
How do you sustain hope and commitment when working with communities facing systemic challenges? I think the answer lies in understanding that change happens slowly, incrementally, through relationships rather than programs, I said in response to a graduate student's question about burnout prevention. When I see Miguel, who started as a shy 8-year-old in our art program and is now running his own community organization in rural Montana, I'm not just seeing one success story. I'm seeing proof that investing in people's potential, believing in their capacity for growth and leadership, creates ripple effects that extend far beyond any individual program or intervention. Another hand went up, a professor from the School of Education. Ms. Morrison, your model seems to require a level of community investment and long-term commitment that might be difficult to replicate in other contexts. How do you respond to critics who argue that your approach is too resource-intensive to scale effectively? It was a fair question, one I'd been asked dozens of times by funders and policymakers focused on cost-effectiveness and measurable outcomes. I'd argue that the real question is, what's the cost of not investing in communities this way? What do we spend on juvenile detention, remedial education, mental health crisis interventions, family court proceedings,